Well, welcome back, everybody. We're going to do two things in this next session, just to warn you. We've got a home front session, but then we have a chance to hear from the curator before lunch, so that then if you go to the gallery, you kind of get a sense of that before you go through there. So two things, home front, then hear from the curator, just so you don't get up and leave when the curator takes the stage. Now, as we move to the World War II years, this session will focus on the home front experiences. And to chair this session, it's my honor to introduce our chair, Dr. Steph Hintershitz. Steph received her PhD in American History from the University of Maryland, College Park. Her books include A Different Shade of Justice, Asian American Civil Rights in the South. Her most recent book, Japanese American Incarceration, the Camps and Coerced Labor During World War II. Steph served here at the museum as a senior historian in our institute, and then she left us to take a teaching post, but we're delighted to have her as one of our ASNUS fellows, so we can keep calling on her talents. Now, on a program note, Steph will be joined on stage by Greg Cook and Matt Delmont, who are already there. Unfortunately, Tracy Parker and Jinx Broussard were unable to attend due to unforeseen circumstances. So if you're looking closely at the agenda, you'll say, hey, that doesn't look like Tracy and Jinx. And there's a reason for that. And, unfortunately, this time of year, those things happen. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Steph Hintershitz.
All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. And what we're going to do with this panel is shift gears a little bit, and we're going to look at what fighting for the right to fight looked like on the home front. So what did that mean for Black Americans to help to support the war effort overseas and abroad, but then also thinking about the home front as a place that had its own battles. So what did that look like here? And in order to help us do that, I am very pleased to welcome our two panelists here. And you do have much more detailed biographies in your program, so I don't want to detract from how accomplished they are, but for the sake of us being able to get into the very fascinating things that they're going to say, I'll keep my bios a little short. So we are pleased to have Gregory Cook, who is a scholar and a documentarian, and he's going to talk a little bit about how you create a history that maybe isn't a written text, but using different innovative techniques to tell a story in a way that isn't just necessarily in a book. But then we also have historian Matt Delmont, who you will hear from again later today, and he is going to provide us with a broad overview looking at the landscape of the home front, and that will help us get set up for Gregory's more detailed intervention. So I will turn it over to Matt. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out. It's wonderful to have a chance to spend the time with people who care about history. Being in the company of folks who care this much about this topic, you would spend Saturday with us. I want to thank Mike, Jeremy, and Connie, and all the members of the museum staff who made this possible. Thank Stephen and Nick for the work they've done to create and lead the museum. I was reminiscing with both Nick and Stephen outside. I think it's 9 years ago that I first came down to the museum for my first interactions. I was at Arizona State University at the time, and it was the early stages of planning for what became the online master's degree in World War II studies. And so it's always an honor and a privilege to be back here at the museum. It's also great to be speaking alongside so many great historians, both the ones who are on the panels today, but also the emerging scholars who spoke yesterday. History truly is a generative exercise. We build on the work of scholars who've come before us, and we try to build on work together in company. And I think today's panel is a representation of that. In that spirit, my presentation builds on Dr. Salmons and Dr. Morrow, who we heard earlier. And I was reflecting on how little time there actually was between the end of World War I and the start of World War II, right? Just 22 years. If you think back to 2003, right, not that long ago, right? You remember things from that time period. You probably have feelings about it, and you would share those with people around you. Same thing was true today. So a lot of what I'm talking about, people's dads, grandfathers, uncles, neighbors, teachers, mentors fought in World War I, and it shaped the perceptions people had on the home front during World War II. Also, hopefully the presentation will set up the post-war presentations we hear later from Dr. Cox and Dr. Lewis. I want to start by at the outset saying something I tell my students in the classroom all the time, which is that we can't understand American history without understanding African American history. Right? And I think given everything else that's going on in the world, this is part of our shared history. Right? These are stories that we need to honor and recognize. My presentation draws from the book Half American. The book has tremendous stories of patriotism and sacrifice, stories that should truly make us be proud to be Americans. There are also challenging parts of the story, stories that are upsetting. John mentioned being angry earlier. Doing this research can make you angry, right? Reckoning with the racism and discrimination that people in the United States faced during World War II should make us frustrated. But to do history honestly requires us to reckon with both those parts of the story, both the things that make us tremendously proud and the things that we want to change. So I want to start by telling you a bit about where the book came from, and it connects to the home front. So this book really grew out of research into the black press, black newspapers like the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, or in this case, the Minneapolis Spokesman. I'm from Minneapolis, so I want to give a shout out to my hometown. Minneapolis Spokesman is the largest and longest running black newspaper in the United States. But doing research for the book that came before Half American on black newspapers, I kept coming across pictures and stories that look like this, featuring some of the more than 1 million black men and women who served the country during World War II. Now, these weren't famous people. These were just average black Minnesotans who served the country. You'd see similar things in Cleveland, Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. And it was seeing all those images that made me curious. I wanted to know what more was there to the story that we weren't talking about. But I think in this context, we can think about black newspapers connecting the war fronts, the battlefields, to the home front. Right? There's only 1 degree of separation for almost anyone in the United States and soldiers serving abroad during World War II. That's true across racial lines, but definitely was true for black Americans. They had family members, friends, loved ones, neighbors serving overseas. One of the things you see in black newspapers from this era is a letter written by a man named James G. Thompson. James Thompson was a 26-year-old from Wichita, Kansas, and in late December 1941, he wrote this tremendous letter to the Pittsburgh Courier as a series of very pressing and pointed questions. He asked in part, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the America I know worth defending? And that phrase, should I sacrifice my life to live half American, stuck with me, so I chose Half American as the title of the book. The Pittsburgh Courier was the nation's largest and most influential black newspaper. They used Thompson's letter to launch what was called the Double Victory campaign. As Dr. Sammons mentioned earlier, Double Victory resonated powerfully for black Americans during World War II because it was a very old idea. It was something that came out of the Civil War, came out of the World War I. The idea that we're going to sacrifice and fight for our country, but in return, we want the ability to have actual freedom and democracy here in the United States. And so that's what Double V stood for. It was victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. I think part of the importance of telling the home front part of the story is that it truly was a battleground for black Americans. They were absolutely committed to military victory, but they recognized that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to defeat Hitler and the Axis forces on the battlefields and then come home to very similar kinds of discrimination here in the United States. So that's why Double Victory was such a powerful framing device. It wasn't just rhetoric or a slogan, it really was a two-front battle. To give you a sense of the scope of this, one of the arguments I make is that we have to start the story of World War II before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Because for black Americans, they were paying attention to the rise of Nazism and fascism nearly a decade earlier. This is the Norfolk Journal and Guide, 1933, an editorial written by a famous black sociologist named Kelly Miller, making direct connections between Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime and the KKK here in the United States. Black Americans were among the first to recognize the really serious threat that Hitler posed because they understood that he was explicitly drawing on American racial policies to justify the treatment of Jews in Europe. And so this is part of the home front story. Throughout the 1930s, black Americans are watching what's happening in Europe and saying, we need to do something about it. Fast forward a couple years, when the Spanish Civil War starts in 1936, that too galvanizes black Americans all over the country. The headline here is Chicago Defender, 1936, saying the Second World War has started because El Duce, that's Mussolini, and Hitler are aiding Franco and the fascists in Spain. There's a group of Americans who volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War, about 3,000 Americans in all, and they were collectively called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Of those, there were 80 black Americans who served. Langston Hughes, the famous poet and author, is fascinated by this. He wants to know, what does it mean for these average black Americans from Alabama, from California, from New York, to uproot their lives, travel to a country they'd never even been to before to fight in that country's civil war. So he became a war correspondent for the Baltimore African American, and he travels to Spain, and he's on the front lines reporting on these black volunteers. Those stories get published back here in the United States and then circulate all across the country. So already by the late 1930s, you have black people after church, in their homes, in their workplaces, talking about the Spanish Civil War, saying we have to do something to stop the rise of fascism. Highlighted here is that Hughes also went on a speaking tour. Right? And so part of the Homefront story is these stories about the emerging war in Europe are circulating broadly in black America. The important civil rights story in the lead up to World War II was the March on Washington movement. So before the United States officially enters the war militarily, President Roosevelt announces that the US will be the arsenal of democracy, providing the war supplies that the Allies need to fight and win the war. And everyone knows what that means. It means jobs. But initially, black Americans are blocked from those valuable war industry jobs. A. Philip Randolph was the most powerful black labor leader at the time. He was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And he threatens to lead 100,000 black Americans in a march on Washington in the summer of 1941 unless President Roosevelt agrees to desegregate the defense industries. It was a tremendously bold threat. Through a series of high-stakes negotiations, President Roosevelt agrees to sign an executive order that, at least on paper, does desegregate those defense industries in exchange for Randolph calling off the march. But it does two important things. The first is it demonstrates black political power on the eve of World War II. Just the very fact that Randolph could persuasively threaten the White House in this way and get Roosevelt to sign this executive order galvanizes black people to keep fighting for their rights in an organized fashion. The second thing it does is it lays a blueprint for some of the activism that takes place after the war. I think everyone's familiar with the March on Washington in 1963. The blueprint for that is laid in 1941. By that point, Randolph is the grandfather of the movement, but the ideas have been circulating for more than 2 decades. So the war officially starts for the US with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This is the headline of the Chicago Defender just after the attack. The editors wrote, "Awake, white America, the hour is at hand." They said, "White America must learn that a Negro in the armed service of his country and the uniform of his government must be respected as a defender of democracy." And so there was a hope that finally, with World War II, something would change, that some of the racism we just heard from World War I would be put aside in recognition of the urgency of fighting for a common cause. On that same page, the Defender highlighted 3 young black Chicagoans who tried to register and volunteer for military service but were turned away. This happened to hundreds of black men across the country. Just like white Americans, they tried to volunteer for military service, but there were hundreds of black Americans who were turned away because at that point, the Army and the Navy didn't yet have enough all-black units to accommodate them. These young men were left dumbfounded. They asked, what's wrong with our patriotism that we can't volunteer our lives to fight for our country? And so these are some of the stories that people are telling after Pearl Harbor. There's also a horrific lynching in St. Louis just weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. A man named Cleo Wright was lynched. That was in Sikeston, Missouri. And so the phrase becomes, remember Pearl Harbor, but remember Sikeston too. Thurgood Marshall, whose mentor was Charles Hamilton Houston, was, of course, the first black Supreme Court justice of the United States, but during the war, he was the head of the legal division for the NWACP. One of the main sources I used for the book were hundreds of letters written to Marshall by soldiers who were stationed on military bases here in the US. So part of the Homefront story is also the fact that you had soldiers being trained for military service who were experiencing racism and discrimination here in the United States. And these letters are harrowing to read. People described being called racial epithets, violence against black troops, in some cases lynching of black troops in uniform while they're training. Men said they would feel safer once they deployed to the European theater or the Pacific theater than they felt here in the United States, in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Thurgood Marshall, during the war, helped to try to bring those cases to justice, helped to make sure people were being treated as they should be treated as soldiers. To give you a sense of what those letters looked like, this is one written by a minister, black minister, at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. He wrote, "I'm a Negro minister here at Camp Shelby, and the conditions are so terrible. We are on the very verge of deserting the Army. Upon my arrival here at Camp Shelby, life has been the same as some big concentration camp. There's so much Hitlerism here." Some of the complaints he cited were common things, like having to wait hours for buses back to camp because they would allow all the white soldiers to get on before any black soldiers could get on. He also described violence on the base. He said, "We have lots of white MPs, military police, who delight in beating colored soldiers." He concluded, "Please, in the name of God and this so-called American Freedom Act, act at once." So this too is the story of the home front. One of the other key civil rights figures I talk about in the book is Ella Baker. She's perhaps best known for her work in the 1960s as part of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was a tremendous grassroots activist. During the war, she was the head of branch membership for the NAACP, and she was wildly successful at her job. The numbers on the screen give you a sense of how much the NAACP grew over the course of the war. When historians talk about World War II being a turning point for civil rights, part of what we mean is that the infrastructure of civil rights got built out over the course of the war. The NAACP goes from being a relatively small organization to being a truly national, massive organization. Having all those members means you have more dues-paying members, more money to fight larger, more complex civil rights cases, like Brown versus Board of Education. One of Baker's key innovations was recognizing you didn't need to be a professional class black person to be a leader. You didn't have to be a doctor or a lawyer. You could be a sharecropper or a domestic worker. And so she held leadership training workshops all over the country, helping to organize black people to be leaders, to fight for their own rights in their own communities. One of the people who attended one of those workshops was Rosa Parks in Atlanta in 1945, fully a decade before the Montgomery bus boycott. Gregory's going to be talking about war workers later, Black Rosies. Rosa Parks was a war worker herself. She worked as a civilian seamstress at Maxwell Air Base during the war. And the story she would tell is that by 1944, the buses at Maxwell Air Base were integrated. And so on base, she could sit wherever she wanted to on the bus. But when she got to the city limits and had to transfer to a Montgomery City bus, then she had to go to the back of the bus. She said that one block transfer felt like going from being a first-class citizen to being a second-class citizen. Her brother Sylvester served in the Pacific Theater. But when he came home to Montgomery, couldn't get a loan to buy a home, couldn't get a job. And so all this steeled her resolve to fight for civil rights. She later said, "I'd always been taught that this was America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. I felt that it should be actual, in action, rather than just something that we hear and talk about." This is one of my favorite documents I found in Ella Baker's papers, and I'll give you the context for it. It was a letter written by a group of men who were in the 392nd Engineer Battalion, writing from Normandy in the fall of 1944, right? So just a few months after the D-Day invasion. And they wrote, "We're making a sacrifice for victory abroad, but that does not ensure us of a victory in our own country. We understand and fully realize that we must fight for the WV and its principles. Knowing that we weren't doing anything toward victory on the home front, we started this collection to aid in the greatest fight toward humanity." And so it's them sending a letter and a contribution to the NAACP and to Ella Baker to fight the Double Victory campaign. And the part that I love the most, on the bottom of the screen, they sent $333.89. Right? And so I picture them passing the hat around, or passing the helmet around, essentially, in Normandy to raise this money. And so again, when we're thinking about the home front, there are direct connections constantly between the war front and the home front. These black soldiers know what's going on at home. They care deeply about what's happening in their home country, and they want to do everything they can to help that fight as well, while they're also fighting in Normandy. Right? It's a remarkable story. To give you a sense of why this is so urgent, and building on some of the stories we heard about racial attacks during World War I, during 1943 alone, there were 240 racial attacks and race riots all across the country. Big cities, small towns, on and near army bases. The one I'm highlighting here is in Beaumont, Texas. On June 15th, 1943, a false rumor circulated in Beaumont that 2 white women had been raped by black men. A crowd of approximately 4,000 people, armed with hammers, axes, and guns, descended on the city's black neighborhoods. The mob looted and burned homes and businesses, and they assaulted many black people. 2 people were killed, and a third died later from wounds sustained during the riot. One commander of the Texas State Guard compared the condition of the city to the destruction he had seen in a World War I battle zone. The city's black neighborhoods, he said, have been literally stomped into the ground. The picture here is from the Baltimore African American, and it's an American flag that's been burned. This flag flew outside of a black business in Beaumont, a man who had sold thousands of dollars in war bonds. And so again, the question, not just in Texas, but across the country for Black Americans was, what's wrong with our patriotism? We're doing everything we can to help fight and win this war, and yet this is how our country or how our communities are being treated. Langston Hughes kept writing during World War II. It wasn't just as a war correspondent. He kept writing and reflecting about the urgency of fighting for the kind of America in which Black Americans would be treated equally. He wrote a poem based on this summer of violence in 1943 called From Beaumont to Detroit. And I want to read it to you because I think it gives you a clear sense of what double victory sounded like. Hughes wrote, "Looky here, America, what you done. Let things drift until the riots come. Now your policemen let your mobs run free. I reckon you don't care nothing about me. You tell me that Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took his lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. You tell me Mussolini's got an evil heart. What must have been in Beaumont that he got his start? Because everything that Hitler and Mussolini do, Negroes get the same treatment from you. You Jim Crowed me before Hitler rose to power, and you're still Jim Crowing me right now, this very hour. Yet you say we're fighting for democracy. Then why don't democracy include me? I ask you this question because I want to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow." So as Hughes so often did, he cut to the chase. Right? This is what was on the minds of most Black Americans in the country during World War II. They're following news from the war front, eager that America is going to win the war, but also dealing with a whole separate war here in the United States, fighting for actual freedom and democracy. So another one of the arguments that the book makes is that for Black Americans, the war didn't end in 1945. Right? That whole generation of Black veterans comes back and keep fighting here in the United States. To give you a sense of what they're fighting against, this is Mississippi Senator James O. Eastland on the floor of the Senate in the summer of 1945. Eastland said, "Negro soldiers have disgraced the flag of their country. The Negro race is an inferior race. I'm proud that the purest form of white blood flows in my veins. I know that the white race is a superior race. It's ruled the world. It's given us civilization. It's responsible for all of the progress on earth." Now, if these words are upsetting to us today, and they should be, imagine how they sounded to Black veterans who just risked their lives, seeing their buddies killed, fighting for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. They were outraged by this. They were even more outraged because they understood that Eastland was only in the Senate because Black people in Mississippi couldn't vote. The population of Mississippi in 1945 is 48% Black, but fewer than 2% of Black Mississippians can vote because of decades of intentional voter disenfranchisement, violence, in some cases murder, to keep Black people from the polls. This is what the Double Victory campaign was about. It was about fighting back against this kind of racism and discrimination. And it shows up in terms of the kind of opportunities that exist for Black veterans after the war. And hopefully everyone's familiar with the GI Bill. It's what made it possible for a whole generation of white veterans to be able to enter the middle class. Part of the reason it mattered that you had men like James O. Eastland with those distorted views is that segregationists controlled many of the key committees in Washington, D.C., and as the GI Bill legislation was being drafted, they ensured that it was going to be distributed at the state and local level. And everyone in 1945 knew what that meant. It meant that you were going to discriminate based on the policies and preferences of states. And that's how it turned out. To give you a couple stats, in Mississippi, only 2 of more than 3,000 VA guaranteed home loans issued in 1947 went to Black borrowers. And things weren't much better up north. Out of 67,000 mortgages issued by the VA in New York and New Jersey in 1947, fewer than 100 went to Blacks. Nationally, by 1950, white veterans had received nearly 98% of VA guaranteed home loans. There's a group of researchers, economists from Brandeis University, that have tried to calculate the long-term impact of discrimination. And what they found is, on average, Black World War II veterans received about $125,000 less from GI Bill benefits than white veterans did. I think an important part of the story as well is that there were thousands of Black veterans who were able to access the GI Bill, and they did amazing things with it. They became doctors, architects, and lawyers. And so one of the stories we have to tell is a story of opportunity costs. If there hadn't been that discrimination, we would have had a whole larger generation of Black professionals come out of World War II, right? Because the men and women who were able to use it did amazing things. The hardest chapter of Half American for me to write was a chapter called Homecoming, where I described some of the violence that Black veterans encountered when they returned to the United States that is frustratingly similar to the violence that Black veterans received after World War I. I won't read all of these stories, but let me highlight just 2 to give you a sense of what this looked like. Maceo Snipes was an Army veteran. he was confronted by 4 KKK members who came to his farmhouse the day after he became the first black person to vote in a Democratic primary in Taylor County, Georgia. Snipes was shot and killed by Edward Williamson, who was also a World War II veteran. George Dorsey served in the Pacific. He'd been home for less than a year when he, his wife Mae Murray, and their friends, Dorothy and Roger Malcolm, were shot 60 times at close range by a white mob in Walton County, Georgia. Dorsey's white landlord, who was implicated in the shooting but never charged, later said, "Up until George went in the Army, he was a good boy. But when he came out, they thought they were as good as white people." This violence against veterans was about power, it was about intimidation. It, more than anything else, was about what kind of country America was going to be after the war. Right? Again, that's why the Double Victory Campaign mattered. It was a claim about the kind of country America could be in the future. And this resonated with black people all across the country, even those who might not have served themselves or didn't have any direct family members who served. One of the first published pieces of writing we have from Martin Luther King Jr. was written as a 17-year-old, a letter to the editor of an Atlanta newspaper reflecting on some of this violence. He said, "We want and are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens." So again, that's why the Double Victory Campaign mattered so much. This battlefront on the home front was something that galvanized black Americans, not just during the war, but after the war as well. And so there were literally hundreds of black Americans who became active participants in the civil rights movement. I'll highlight just a few here, and I know Dr. Cox is going to be talking more about this history. Hosea Williams actually lied about his age to join the Army at 16. He served in the Army, and then came home and helped co-lead the Southern Christian Leadership Conference alongside Dr. King. Whitney Young was also an Army veteran. He helped to lead the National Urban League and was one of the co-leaders of the March on Washington. Debbie Johnson Roundtree served in the Women's Army Corps. She used the GI Bill to earn a law degree from Howard University Law School and open up a pioneering law firm in Washington, D.C., won a number of important civil rights cases, including a discrimination case against Sarah Keyes, who was also a U.S. Army veteran who had to give up her seat on a bus in a case not dissimilar to the Rosa Parks case, but that happened earlier. Harry Briggs served in the Navy, came back to South Carolina, and actually lost his job as a gas station attendant when he brought a civil rights case against school segregation in his hometown in South Carolina. His case was one of 4 cases that was combined into Brown versus Board of Education. And perhaps the most famous example is Medgar Evers. He served loading cargo for the Red Ball Express, the black truck drivers. His unit landed on Omaha Beach just days after the D-Day invasion. He's just 19 years old. On his 21st birthday, in 1946, he tried to lead a group of black veterans to register to vote in Decatur, Mississippi, only to be turned away by a white mob with guns. He said, "I had been on Omaha Beach. All we black soldiers wanted was to be ordinary citizens. We fought during the war for America, Mississippi included. Now, after the Germans and Japanese hadn't killed us, it looked as though white Mississippians would." Evers, of course, took on increasingly important roles in the NAACP in Mississippi over the course of the 1950s and 60s. He helped to investigate the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955 and kept fighting for voting rights and civil rights until he was assassinated in 1963. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. So let me conclude here and just say that the stories we tell about the past matter. It matters deeply that we tell these stories and tell them honestly. Because this generation of Black World War II veterans, I think one of the things that's so inspiring about that history is that they never stopped fighting for America. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And then we'll go ahead and hear from Gregory now.
Good morning or afternoon. Good morning. I want to thank everyone, the World War II Museum and all the people Matt mentioned for bringing me here. It's always a great honor. I've been here multiple times. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach and talk about the women of my documentary, Invisible Warriors, African American Women in World War II. But first, a very brief story. When I was 6 years old, I went to the dentist for the first time. I went to a white dentist, and I had 2 of my teeth drilled without Novocaine. I've been hearing these stories. I'll be 70 years old soon. I've been hearing these stories, whether they're military, civilian, whatever, all of my life. And so sitting here listening to these great presentations by these outstanding scholars, emotionally, it's like having my teeth drilled without Novocaine. African Americans know what I'm talking about. I'm not sure other people do. So what I want to do is personalize the stories of the 600,000 African American Rosita Riveters that before I did my documentary, very, very few people knew about them, even scholars. We're talking about 600,000 black women who were Rosita Riveters. And I want you to get to know them individually because, you know, they were just regular people who happened to be in a special time for them. And I want to personalize them because two of the women in my documentary are still living. One of them, Mrs. Susan King, turns 101 in July, and the baby of all the group, she just turned 95 on April 2nd. She's still living. There's a common theme running throughout these women's lives, as well as the presentations you've heard today. And it's how Jim Crow, segregation, whatever name you want to give it, was a constant in their lives. It's been a constant in my life. But as the Eagles talked about last week, adversity is what shapes and builds your character. Yeah. So all of these women were children, young adults, teenagers during the Great Depression. That's another thing that all these folks had in common. The Great Depression, which was like serious stuff for all Americans, but it was more serious stuff for black folks. And it's not so much that black folks lost material stuff because most of them had nothing to lose materially, but they were subjected to violence, discrimination, all these things that stunted, hindered, and destroyed their lives. Interestingly enough, because of the times they were born in, I believe, and because of what they endured throughout their lives, they went on and had some remarkable lives, particularly when you look at where and when they were born and where they were when they transitioned out of this world.
Women wanted for war production work. More and more men are being called into the armed forces. Their jobs must be filled, and filled now. And who can fill them? You women.
Working at the Navy Yard made me feel patriotic, that I did something to help the cause. We were doing something to help the boys, and it just made you feel special.
Looked at us, we were all maybe 100 pounds apiece. We decided that we could be riveters.
I wanted to go join, and then it was as far as, and I was told in my face that we cannot accept you because you're black.
And I found out that they were putting 3 X's. I knew that was to recognize us as being Negroes, we were called at that time.
We just felt like that we have a job to do at home, and I felt real good about that. And we as women, we had to keep the home front up, because many of us did the jobs that they said only the men had done.
The first day on the job at the Navy Yard, I was scared to death.
When World War II started, I wouldn't let myself cry. for anything. I was going to be strong and brave.
When men were in the service, the women had to take over, be the breadwinners, pay all the bills, and take care of the house.
There was a racist notion that black women carried venereal disease and other kinds of diseases.
I still suffer headaches. I take medication every day.
Washington was deeply segregated. It was so segregated that you had the feeling that you were in a foreign country.
We just worked hard all day, picking cotton till my fingers bled.
Well, you were sort of in slavery when you were sharecropping.
He just said, "Nick, if you bring your black ass in my office one more time and ask me a question, I'll fire you."
In Alabama at that time wasn't nothing free but a white man and a black woman.
I was able to bring a paycheck home higher than anybody in my family.
We can do it, and we did it.
This is this is my mother. My favorite Rosie of all time. She introduced me to Rosie when I was a kid. I was 3, 4 years old. For some reason, you know, we were very close, and she was a stay-at-home mom at that time. And so for some reason, when I was 3 or 4 years old, she told me about her World War II story. She told me how when she was 18 years old, she rode on her suitcase, from Norfolk, Virginia to Washington, D.C., to get her very first job as a clerk typist in the U.S. Patent Office. This picture was taken in 1944. She was 19 years old. Mom never told me about the fact that she rode in a Jim Crow car. I'm 3, 4 years old. You know, what's that mean? She never told me that she was heading to a deeply segregated Washington, D.C. The reason I remembered her story was because of the train ride. I've had a lifelong love affair with trains. There was nothing in her story that made me remember it. What's the clerk typist? I'm 3 or 4 years old. What's the U.S. Patent Office? I'm 3 or 4 years old. It was the train ride. And my mother, like so many, like virtually all the black Rosies I've met, certainly the 7 who are in my documentary, my mother transitioned in 2006 not knowing that she was part of history. In 1944, 43, during World War II, she didn't see her picture in a recruiting poster, right? She didn't. But yet the federal government sent out invitations all across the country to black churches, to the black community, telling black women, come to Washington. We need you to run the federal government. And so my mother responded, right? And what a lot of people don't get or know, that prior to the war, a lot of jobs that came to be associated with women, typing, filing, et cetera, were actually held by white males. And so when the war comes, of course, they are drafted or volunteer for the service. And so who's going to do the paperwork? Who's going to run the government? And so hundreds of thousands of women came to Washington to run the government, to do, you know, even today, nothing happens anywhere unless somebody types up a piece of paper for it, digital or real, for it to happen. And that's what my mother did, and I often wonder what may have crossed her desk, 80 years ago when she's typing. What kind of stuff? She worked in a patent office. I'll never know, but Mom never knew that she was a Rosie. And I think one of the things I'm most proudest of for my documentaries, I have expanded the definition and understanding of who Rosies were, right? Because, heretofore, the image of Rosie was a white woman with a bandana flexing her muscle, and that's the popular image, which really didn't become popular till the 1960s for the women's movement, parenthetically white women's movement. But Mom did this work, and I have expanded the understanding definition of Rosie to be any woman who was in war work was a Rosie. And women were coast watchers. Women ran USOs. A USO is like a nightclub / hotel. That's when all that stuff started. You name it, women did it. Somewhere between 5 and 8 million American women were Rosies, doing jobs in thousands of different categories, and 600,000 of them were African American women. 600,000. And if we look at the 1940 census, if you were to put all 600,000 African American Rosies in one city, they would have been the 13th most populous city in America. 600,000. But nobody knows about them or knew about them. So, like I said, I only remembered her story because of the train ride. Interestingly enough, because of my love of trains and how the universe sometimes works, my very first job out of graduate school, I was a freight brakeman with Consolidated Rail out of Philadelphia. I was a freight brakeman. I survived 6 crashes and train derailments in a 7-week period before I moved into HR, which is what I was originally hired to do. So it was the train ride that made me remember Mom's story. And I wish I started this documentary 3 years after she transitioned, and I got a million questions I would have asked. But I'm so grateful she told me that story when I was 3 or 4 years old. So this is Mom. This is Mrs. Susan King, right? She's the only Rosie in my documentary. When I met her, she knew that she had done something historically significant. I met her at a local Rosie meeting in Baltimore City. And what was interesting about it was she was the only black person there. She was the only black Rosie there. And I got up to speak because I'm trying to get information. And everybody, the leadership, the president of the local, et cetera, is sitting behind me. And I'm asking questions to the audience about, tell me about the racial fireworks in Baltimore during World War II, because there were a lot. And the president was behind me giving the women in the audience eye signals, don't talk to him, don't answer him. I didn't know that at the time because she's behind me, but someone later told me. Right? Mrs. Susan King, she'll be 101 in July. Remarkable woman. Think about this. And I just recently learned this. She was born a premature baby. She was so small that her family members they had to knit a cap for her head. She was so small, they used a house cat for a model to knit the cap. But it was too big. Think about it. What are the odds of a black baby surviving in rural Virginia in 1924 surviving? What are the odds of that happening? They didn't have all the tubes and machines that they'll hook a preemie up to today. And yet today, she's 100 going on 101. So she's already lived longer than 99.999% of all humans who've ever lived. And she started out as a premature baby. So her family moves to Baltimore. Her father's trying to get a better job for the family. They move from rural Virginia to Baltimore. She graduates high school, and she goes to the National Defense Training School. And they were all over the country. And she went there, and they trained her to be a riveter. This is Rosie the Riveter, okay? They trained her to be a riveter. And she told me in talking that she worked with her girlfriend. They were partnered together. Segregation continued in many of the industries where it was possible. When you're talking assembly line work and some of these other jobs, a lot of times it's impossible to segregate. But often when there was opportunities to do that, black women were segregated, meaning they put her with another black woman. And she, because riveting required two people, right? So she went there, she got a job with Eastern Aircraft in Baltimore. Eastern Aircraft was part of General Motors. And she riveted part of the tail section of a fighter plane, Navy carrier plane. And so we talked, she said some of the things she remembers the first time she ever wore pants. And as she said, back then, all ladies wore dresses. But, because of the war, she started wearing pants. I met a Rosie, a white woman, told me her father was about to put her out of the house because she was wearing pants. If you were a lady, a woman, you didn't wear pants in 1940s. You just didn't. Mrs. King also, it was her first time, Eastern Aircraft was integrated. She said it was the first time she'd ever been in an integrated environment in her life where she was eating. Okay? She made more money than anyone in her family because of her job. Mrs. King says she never wanted to be an industrial worker. She says she wanted to be a teacher or a nurse or something because she saw that as a way of getting out of poverty. Long story short, she went to Hampton Institute, then transferred to Morgan State. She got a graduate degree, became a high school counselor. So look at where her life started. Premature baby. What are the odds of surviving? She goes on, she's still living, got a college degree, 2 degrees. Long shot, only in America, I guess. Mrs. Ruth Wilson, my second favorite Rosie to my mother. Mrs. Wilson, I met her in Philly. She's from Philly. She recently transitioned. She was 102 years old. Okay. People ask me, well, how'd you find these people? And sometimes I would go to senior care facilities. I would go to churches. Some was word of mouth. But in her case, something told me, I don't remember now why I went there, but I went to a senior care facility. The administrator, and I asked, the administrator, can you put a little blurb in your local, newsletter? And she said, yeah, but the woman, the administrator went on the intercom and says, anybody here, any women here who did work during World War II? Mrs. Wilson responded. Okay. She was a domestic. And that was the plight of most black women. According to data, 1940, more than 80% of all black women who were employed were either domestics or sharecroppers. More than 80%. Mrs. Wilson made $5 a day, 6 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day. If you were a sharecropper, very high probability you didn't get paid at all, because sharecropping was really a 100-year extension of enslavement of black people. She told me stories about the indignity she faced in life. She was a domestic for a Jewish couple. A woman came up from Georgia. Mrs. Wilson's in the house dancing. She was a live-in at that time. She's in the house dancing with the kids. And the woman says to her, I'm not allowed to stay here because she's here, and we're not allowed to associate with niggas. That's a direct quote. I've learned that quote. And fortunately, her employer said, well, you leave because Ruth isn't a nigga, she's a member of the family. But Mrs. Wilson had all kinds of indignities in her life because of her skin color. Her husband, during World War II, was overseas in Europe. He was in graves registration. Someone already touched on that. She was refused one time she took her charges to a restaurant. They wouldn't wait on her. They said, we'll serve the children who were white, but you can't do this. We're not going to wait on you. So she left. Again, we're back to that constant theme again about having your life stunted or being insulted or whatever other word you want to use. But anyway, during the war, she quit her job as a domestic, went to the Philadelphia Navy Yard, helped build the aircraft carrier USS Valley Forge. And what was interesting about that, the war ended before the carrier was completed. And so she never got to see on the day that they commissioned the carrier, her daughter was sick. So she didn't see it. So 3 years ago, I arranged for the Philadelphia Navy Yard to do something about that. We had all the local press there. There was some national coverage. Mrs. Wilson returned to Dry Dock 5 for the first time since the end of World War II. And they presented her with a picture of the aircraft carrier she had never seen, that she worked on. Okay. But she told me after the war, she's making big money. And keep in mind, there was nothing to buy during the war. So this is a generation that came out of the Depression who knew how to save money, and because of rationing, there was really nothing to splurge on. So she saved her money, right, which was typical. But she said after the war, there was a big letdown, because like most of these women, right after the war, she had to go back to domestic service, because this was 1945, right? But she went on to have a remarkable life. She told me, she worked for AAA, she worked for a coat company. She wound up retiring with 3 different pensions, right? But she also said, and this was very common, her independence that she gained, knowing how to take care of the house, knowing how to pay bills, et cetera, it took a toll on her marriage. I got to speed this up. Gwendolyn Faison, electronic assembler, RCA, similar story. The SPARs wouldn't accept her. Moved to Camden, New Jersey, RCA. She was very good in math. She became a supervisor. Didn't give her a new title, didn't give her any more pay, but she became a supervisor. And you heard in the trailer what they said to her. her supervisor said to her. But she went on to say it was one of the most important experiences of her life. Adversity, again, building her character. She became the first black female mayor of Camden, New Jersey at the age of 73, right? Yeah. The real sad part about that is when she was mayor, she would go to the local schools. Camden's very, very poor, mostly black and Latino. She would go around to the schools and talk about her experiences. She said the kids didn't believe that she had to ride in the back of a bus and pick cotton. Mrs. Willie Mae Govan, ordnance manufacturer, E.I. DuPont. She was injured making gunpowder, and you saw her in the trailer, right? She's injured making gunpowder, and basically she said where she worked, only black women were out there. And she had to leave when they would shake down the powder. She and the other black women had to leave the building for 4 hours every day. They send her out in the field to cut grass. She's the only woman who acknowledged sexual harassment, and she lost her job because she refused to, give it up to her white bosses. She was an organizer in the civil rights movement. She told me her and her husband sent money to Dr. King and Rosa Parks in 1955. They tried to murder her 2 times because she was an organizer, civil rights movement. When she was 60, she earned her high school diploma. 60. After she earned her high school diploma, she became an ordained minister. After she became an ordained minister, she bought a plot of land. After she bought a plot of land, she built a chapel on the land. She's bad. They're all bad. So, victory. What does victory look like? These women overcame racial and gender barriers, okay? They did. They challenged, the norm of the day. And they changed the employment arc for all black women. All black women today, specifically, are standing on their shoulders, right? I believe arguably they are the greatest group, and I emphasize group, of black women post-enslavement. 600,000, okay? And lastly, these women, like my mother, during that time, they were raised to be ladies. You spoke a certain way in public. You carried yourself a certain way in public. You didn't wear pants except if you worked in a factory. But they were all raised to be ladies, and that's a term that's fallen out of favor today, I think. But I got to tell you, there were some badass women, and that cannot be taken from them. So these are the invisible warriors, and, they're invisible no more. Thank you.
All right, so I definitely want to make sure to save time for Q&A from the audience, but I do have really one big question for both of you. And you have a quote in your book, Matt. It's on page 135, so you should buy the book so you can read more than just 135, where you describe a member of a committee, so government committee, discussing Executive Order 8802. So you brought it up too, Gregory, ending, supposedly, discrimination in a lot of wartime industries. And this member of the government said that, quote, this was a war order, not a social document. So the idea that this was not supposed to solve every racial issue in the country, it's just a wartime order. But you both demonstrate how, especially black women, but black Americans in general, took that as an opportunity to really push for change. And Matt, you had also mentioned that World War II was important for building the infrastructure of civil rights. So I was just gonna ask for both of you to talk a little bit more about just how important labor was during World War II and how important that was for building the civil rights movement to come.
Thank you so much for the question, Stephanie. So labor was incredibly important. And I think the quote's a nice one because wars have always been times of change, right? And people try to take advantage of that, ideally, to create opportunities that hadn't existed previously. And I think, Greg, your work does a really wonderful job of showing how these kind of factory work was entirely off limits to black women previously. Labor mattered, I mean, for one of the most basic reasons, because it was a paycheck, right? That's why black people were so eager to get into defense industries, is because the amount of money they could make doing that was far exceed anything they could make otherwise. But it was also about pride and the kind of work you could do, and having to be recognized in a way that being a sharecropper, being a domestic worker, just wasn't recognized. There was a hope that it was going to be a foothold that they could continue after the war, and that frustratingly often was not the case. They were often the first fired once men, particularly white men, came home from the war. But I think the other thing it showed was organizing. One of the things that was important about getting access to those war industry jobs is most at that time were still union controlled. And so getting a foothold meant being able to work as a group to try to make claims on the ability to keep this work in the years after the war. And so it's a really important part of the larger story we tell about the home front during the war.
Great, thank you.
Get closer. Labor was very important. For example, one of the things that people really don't talk much about or know much about is women were really the backbone of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, A. Philip Randolph. They were doing a lot of the organizing. There was a women's auxiliary. So women were the wives, family members of the actual porters were major players in the labor union. Of course, he started the first black labor union, right? So very important there. And when the war comes, it gives black women an opportunity to get out of white folks' kitchens and out of the fields, right? And it gives them an opportunity to make more money than they had ever made before. Let's be real. I mean, there was some patriotism involved, but this was about dollars and cents. A lot of these women did have people. A couple of women I didn't show, her brothers went off to war. She was a sharecropper, and her brothers went off to war, but they came back, couldn't vote. So the war gives black women this opportunity, and black people, this opportunity to make more money than they'd ever made before. And if you were in the military, if you're in the federal government, everybody got paid the same thing. So if you were a private in the U.S. Army, black, white, whatever you were, you got paid the same thing. If you're level 1, level 2 in the federal government, everyone got paid the same thing. But Mrs. Bernice Bowman told me she worked for the General Accounting Office in Washington. All of the white workers were given raises to grade 2. The black workers never got a raise, right, the whole time she was there. Mrs. Bowman did go on to have a long career in the federal government. So, labor was a game changer for African Americans and, these women in particular. And of course, you're helping other people in the community, right? And so you're not only uplifting yourself and your own family, you're also helping to uplift the community with the resources. And you're a model. You're a model for other people to look up to and say, look at what she did. Like I said, the real sad part about this is most of these women I've met went to their graves, including my mother, not knowing that they had done something historically significant.
Great, thank you. And I do think listening to both of your presentations, and really all the presentations that you're going to hear today, emphasize the importance of making sure that these stories become part of American history, that they are absolutely integral, and there's so much that if it's not integrated, that will get overlooked. So I have more questions, but I do want to turn it over to the audience for any Q&A, and then, so my colleagues will be coming around with the microphone.
We'll start towards the back, straight ahead from y'all.
Hello, my name's Lenora Gobert. I have two questions, and I'm going to ask them at the same time because I don't know if you'll get back around to me. The first one is for Dr. Delmont. You talked about the percentages of GI Bill that you never mentioned the West Coast, and a lot of our families went to the West Coast. So what percentage were the guys in the West Coast able to take advantage of that? The second question is, for the union for the sleeping car porters, what about the cooks? Were they part of that? My maternal grandfather was a cook on the railroad, so I'm curious about that.
Thank you for both questions. In terms of the West Coast, I don't have percentages to give you, but the story in the South with the GI Bill was almost complete discrimination for reasons that you could anticipate. If there's official Jim Crow segregation, most Black Americans couldn't take advantage of the GI Bill benefits or could only use them in very specific ways. Outside of the South, it depended a lot on who your local person was that you're trying to go to seek the benefits from, the local VA office or GI Bill office. And so in California, I think the things I would highlight is there was definitely discrimination in many places. For higher education, which was one of the main things people would use the benefits for, most main colleges and universities, including on the West Coast, had quotas about how many blacks they would accept. And so the University of California system, University of Washington, University of Oregon, had a handful of black students that would be integrated, technically, but they were in no position to accommodate the groundswell of returning veterans who might have wanted to go to college. And so part of the discrimination that was built in to the GI Bill was that it didn't open up more opportunities for HBCUs, primarily in the South, to be able to grow, to expand, to meet the number of veterans. And then outside of the South, it didn't do anything to address the quotas that existed. There definitely also, in terms of home ownership, there were many specific cases of homeowners, white homeowners, organizing to keep black people from buying homes in specific neighborhoods in California. I don't have stats to be able to give you, but that was definitely something that showed up quite a bit as well. And then the second piece, absolutely, cooks were part of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It was meant to address everyone who worked in any capacity on the railroads. And it's part of what gave the organization the heft that it did. When Randolph makes this threat that 100,000 black people are going to march in Washington, D.C., he's the figurehead of it, but it's people all across the country, including a lot of black women who are the local captains. This is how organizing's always worked. Right? You've got local people all over the country who are organizing their local groups, saying, yes, we're going to do this, writing editorials, holding marches. That involved a lot of the cooks, but also a lot of women working on the ground.
Next question is going to be to your right.
Thank you, Goals, for your research and work in this space. That's really to everybody. It's really kind of sewing into the space of providing clarity on the African American experience in space, right? I'm Leviticus Cleveland, Air Force veteran, grandson of a World War II veteran. My question to you is really about, there is a coordinated effort or attack on how we tell history, just generally speaking. That is very prominent within the last year or so. As you are likely aware, a few weeks ago, the Air Force paused for a moment their training and awareness to new airmen about the Tuskegee Airmen, for example. And I think that's kind of back in line with that. What are your thoughts on that? How do we keep this just truth telling alive?
I'm going to be very brief about that. I think America has changed, but it has not evolved. And so we've been down this path before. And there's always going to be resistance. And depending upon the time and space and history we are, it's going to have more legs than others, you know. But my own view is I don't think America has evolved. It has changed. And it's like one generation, you're wearing a blue suit, the next generation, you're wearing a gray suit, the next generation is brown. But the person, the institutions wearing the suit haven't changed. And voting, for example, education, that's like democracy 101. And 60 years after a lot of this legislation, still fighting that same battle.
Matt, if you teach the next generation, can you talk about being a teacher at these times?
Yeah,
Professor.
like many of my colleagues here. It's a great question. It's obviously one that's on all of our minds right now. And to hear my goal for myself and my colleagues at Dartmouth, I think it's true for all my colleagues who teach, is our goal is very similar to the museum's goal, right? Our goal is to tell the truth about the past based on evidence, right? And we don't sway with political winds, right? The things I write about in my book were true when Trump was first in the White House, when Biden's in the White House, when Trump's back in the White House. They would be true of Obama or Bush or whoever's in the future, right? My obligation as a professional historian is to tell the truth about the past based on evidence, right? I think that goal, and I think the reason for forums like this are incredibly important, is that part of the attack on higher education, the way we teach history, is distorted. It's intentionally an effort to score political points and using history to do that, which is obviously upsetting to me as a historian. It also does a disservice to us as a nation, right? If we're going to understand where we might go in the future, we have to understand what happened in the past, and we do a disservice to all the men and women who served in World War II if we can't talk about those stories honestly. On the military piece, it's frustrating to me, I think Dr. Lewis will talk more about the work that the military has done since integration. The military deserves a tremendous amount of credit for being on the forefront of thinking about issues about inclusion, equity, and diversity, right? From 1948 to the present, right? It took them long enough to get there, right? But they've done an amazing job. Part of why they've done an amazing job, though, is they understood it's mission critical, right? They're not doing it to be politically correct. They recognize that if you're going to have an efficient, lethal fighting force, you have to be able to draw on the capacities of all Americans to get rid of the discrimination that we heard about in World War I and World War II. As upset as I am as an educator, I'm equally upset on behalf of folks who are in the military that recent efforts are walking that back, right? Not understanding where the military has come from and how it's learned from its past, right? I think that it's antithetical to what it means to create successful, diverse teams that draw from the reality of the American population today.
We're going to stay to your right here.
Good morning. My name's Edith Michelle, and I come from the museum side of the house. I work for the Woodrow Wilson House Museum in Washington, D.C. And so I'm really pleased to see this exhibit today, Fighting for the Right to Fight. But I think museums have now a greater responsibility to not just have these exhibits for 1 or 2 months, but to make them part of their permanent collection so the story can continue to be told. And I hope that the next step for this museum, World War II National Museum in New Orleans, is to make not only this exhibit permanent, but to grow the story, because you know there's more layers to it that have not been told.
In the back to your right.
Good morning, I guess almost afternoon. My name is Peter Anderson. I'm sitting here with my sister Lauren Anderson, who lives right up the road. I happen to be here in town for a convention, and lo and behold, this symposium is happening today, so I stayed for an extra day. The reason I stayed for an extra day is because this is my second opportunity to visit my dad here at the museum. My sister, many years ago, saw that they were going to be doing an exhibit and donated his uniform. So I visited that uniform with my mom a number of years ago. We just lost her in July at 97. So I'm back to see my dad. So I'm inviting everybody that goes into the exhibit to look for the display of Lawrence Anderson, who served on the USS Lexington in World War II, obviously on a segregated aircraft carrier. His experience was so profound for him that conversations about World War II did not exist in our family. We did not see his uniform practically until it was here in this museum. So I echo what you're asking. Thank you.
Thank you to you and your family.
My third question, how do we get to see and where can we see your documentary?
It is not in distribution yet. There is some interest. I will be very honest. Technically, it was just finished last week. I've been screening it for 2.5 years. So we're talking about a journey that took 15 years and 2 months. And I just dotted the last I last week. I made it, yeah. I made it for education. I made it for young people and those not yet born. So I have STEAM and social studies and history curricula to accompany it for grades 8 through 12. But it is not in distribution yet. We're getting there, but it has to be, the right match. I've shown it here,
we've had
I
a
think,
screening
twice.
here.
Yeah.
And I
The
would
World
say,
War- I'm sorry.
Greg, for every 10 authors that I know who wish they had another page or another chapter, I could show you 100 documentarians I've dealt with who never quite finish it. They're always tweaking their documentaries because there's always that other story you want to add. And but no, we've been proud to screen it. I think twice. You said twice, right?
Yeah.
I know once.
Yeah.
I think twice.
Twice, yeah.
Any other questions? I know Steph has a few in her. Oh, we got one right here. We got a microphone for
Oh, I'm so sorry. There we go. Oh, God, I can hear myself now. Of these esteemed women, you described one who was rejected by the SPARs.
Yes.
Now, I think many people here don't know who the SPARs were, but they were the naval branch of the Coast Guard. And as such, they were involved with coastal security. It was the only branch that truly developed a strategy for the interception and protection of the coast. They, of course, were in combat as well. But I found it interesting that you made mention of her rejection by this branch of service, a branch of service that depended on male and female African Americans who had mobility to get to the ports, to get to the zones of service for both the men and machines. Was there any branch of service, therefore, that embraced men and women of color during this critical period of time? Because you mentioned one that did not.
I think there were 3 black women in the SPARs, 3, 4, something like that by the end of the war. My view is that none of the services actually embraced black people. And when the war started, black men were not intelligent enough to fly airplanes and were not intelligent enough to drive tanks. As the war progressed, their IQs went up. And as they were needed, so their IQs went up, and so we had the Tuskegee Airmen, 761st Tank Battalion, and others. But the general feeling was, my view is the military didn't embrace any of these people. And none of the branches did. And the reality is that there are a whole lot of jobs in the military that have to be done. Somebody has to dig ditches and latrines. That's just, somebody has to do that. The issue was making black people, that was all that they were seen as capable of doing. And there are all kinds of jobs in the military. You don't make documentaries about them. You're not going to make a movie about somebody unloading a ship. But without those kinds of jobs, none of the other stuff happens. But my view is at the beginning of the war, none of these people were really embraced.
Just a minute, sir. We need the microphone with you.
That's what the SPARs did. They were actually transporters of material, and they were small crafts. So the idea of bringing anyone into these positions that could add muscle, thought, and mobility, it seems like the very definition of success. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And with that, we have one. You can have 2.
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you again for a lovely presentation. My question kind of circles around the home part of the home front. You talk a lot about labor, and I think labor cannot be separated from the home sphere, and particularly with regards to women. I mean, they're really dual-hatting it at this point in the war. So I'm wondering, how did this kind of mass movement to labor, working in the federal government, working in the factories, translate into the living conditions experienced by African Americans, and particularly African American women during the war? And I'm thinking specifically about moving into housing, schooling. They're obviously coming with children, and that increase in pay. they're often finding themselves not necessarily where they're from and new locales. So how is that labor and movement translating into the lived experience in the homes of these individuals during this time during the war? Thank you.
Yes, there were a lot of people moving all across the country, but the fact that they were moving into places created racial anxiety and violence among and from whites. Detroit was probably, June 1943, Detroit was probably the most violent racial action during World War II. And in Detroit, you know, the black population in Detroit swelled by 50,000 people coming to Detroit for jobs. And of course, when you have pressure for jobs, okay, there's also pressure for housing. There's also pressure for schooling. And it did not go well socially, you know, and blacks who moved to northern cities were herded into ghettos. Right, and so you have these same kinds of problems, and to some extent they exist to this day. Inferior quality housing, inferior, you know, education, right? And in Detroit, what was interesting, there was a public housing project, Sojourner Truth Public Housing, and it was all white. And so when black folks tried to move in, that was just another example, it didn't go well. And so in June 1943, it all exploded. Again, you have you know, white mobs attacking black people, going into the black communities and burning, killing, etc. And that's old behavior. And I'd just like to mention, 2 days later in Bamber Bridge, England, the Battle of Bamber Bridge erupted, in some ways for the same issues. You know, the treatment of black soldiers. In this case, the catalysts were white MPs. Well, the police always had a hand in a lot. They had a hand in a lot of this turmoil and unrest. But I think fundamentally it was like black people moving into virgin spaces, and there was this pushback by the white citizens already there. And Detroit, I think, really exemplified that in June of 1943. Yeah.
So we're going to say thank you to Steph, to Matt, to Greg. Let's give them a round of applause.